Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT how to play video. Today our analyst will be diving into how to play Draven Legionnaire for patch 11.19. Draven is back and playable after being buffed in multiple patches and a mini rework in the most recent one. We'll be covering why Draven is viable as well as what the core items, champions, and traits are that make Draven Legionnaire a top comp. Along with that, we'll do a brief overview of each stage of the game and end with a few positioning tips. Let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we dive into how to play Draven, let's first answer, why is Draven viable? Ever since the mid-set dropped, Draven has been barely playable as a carry. That is, until now, specifically the latter half of patch 11.18. At the end of that patch, Draven was one of the better comps in the meta, especially in specific regions. Part of that was due to the meta shifts from the 11.18b patch, but the culmination of repeated buffs finally caught up with old Draven. And then 11.19 dropped and changed it all. Well, sort of. By changed, we mean they reworked Draven to now ignore 50% of the target's armor as a passive. Along with that, they also nerfed several aspects of his kit, basically lowering his overall damage. But math came to the rescue, showing that across the board, Draven was doing more damage than he previously was, particularly because Last Whisper was no longer a required item. Of course, how well Draven does depends a lot on the lobby, but it seems, for now at least, Draven is finally a consistent AD carry in the meta. This is mainly due to his damage output that no longer relies on having a Last Whisper, opening the door for more innovative item builds. Legionnaire is also doing well enough in the meta with a plethora of early, mid, and late game options. Lastly, the way players are positioning Draven has increased the odds of winning rounds with him. Basically, the idea is to frontline him next to melee champions. This can be risky, but it does give Draven the advantage over compositions like Vel'Koz and Lucian. Combine this new positioning tech, the introduction of a new passive that ignores 50% of the target's armor, as well as no longer relying on Last Whisper, has helped push Draven to the forefront of the meta. Now, we can focus our shift over to the composition surrounding Draven, beginning with the core items. As the name of the composition suggests, the main carry is Draven. Now that Draven no longer requires Last Whisper to deal damage against champions with a lot of armor like Ironclad, it's possible for the third item to be utility focused or just pack on more damage. But in general, the idea behind itemizing Draven is the same as any AD carry: swords. The sword is of the highest priority when it comes to components, whether that's from Carousel or the Armory. Without sword-based items, Draven will do a lot less damage. So it's important to prioritize this component if you have any inclination towards playing Draven. As for what items to make, it varies depending on what other components you have. In general, you can get by with quite a few options on Draven, since the main goal is to just have anything that increases damage. This means any auto attack item works well for Draven. Something like Infinity Edge, Deathblade, and Giant Slayer. Titan's Resolve and Hand of Justice are both comparable in effectiveness to the other items, but aren't as common. Honestly, it's perfectly viable to fill all 3 item slots with these types of damage-focused items, as the whole goal is to just increase Draven's output. Legionnaire already provides some healing and attack speed, so utility is not always a necessity. That said, most players will have at least one utility item. That can be any of Rageblade, Runan's Hurricane, Quicksilver, or Bloodthirster. Basically, any item that provides some type of utility benefit will work well as the third item. Rageblade is particularly effective because it helps Draven scale during the round, while Bloodthirster helps him survive to the end. Before we touch on the other items in the composition, let's briefly mention a few Radiant items for Draven. Any Radiant version of an item that was already mentioned is fine to use, particularly Radiant Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, or Deathblade. Common utility Radiant items to use are Radiant Zeeks, Banshees, and one of the recently buffed items, Locket. Radiant Locket helps by increasing the survivability of most of your board, especially since positioning Draven in the front line with melee champions is a common tactic. As for what other items to grab, really any frontline or utility item works well. Zeeks is useful, as is Banshees. Frozen Heart is fantastic if you're using Diana, and items for Yasuo as a secondary carry can be useful too. What matters the most is focusing on Draven items as the priority. One last thing regarding items is emblems. By far the best is a Legionnaire emblem, as this makes running 6th Legionnaire a lot easier. Other options include Forgotten, Ironclad, and Mystic. The best, as we said, is Legionnaire. Let's now move on to the core champions and traits for Draven Legionnaire. There's quite a few variations that are viable when it comes to using Draven as the main carry. Legionnaire and Forgotten are the two most consistent traits to use alongside Draven, with the amount of both fluctuating based on what version you're playing. There's 6 Legionnaire 2 Forgotten, 4 Legionnaire 4 Forgotten, 4 Legionnaire 4 Knights, and a lot of minor variations of each. But those are the 3 most common. Additional traits that are used are Ironclad, Cavalier, Mystic, Assassin, and Nightbringer. But let's focus on the likely lineup a Draven composition will have at level 8. Those champions are Draven, Aurelia, Riven, Yasuo for Legionnaire, with Thresh, Galio, Nautilus, and Rel rounding out the rest of the comp. This is the basic 4 Legionnaire composition with an emphasis on defensive strategy between Ironclad and Knights. There are plenty of ways that you can augment this composition, such as Viego replacing Thresh to pair with Diana, or adding in Mystic with Lulu and Gwen. Revenant is a much less common frontline, but is still viable if it's what's being hit instead of Galio and Rel. Speaking of Galio, he's one of the more essential parts of the comp because the taunt of his ability helps keep Draven alive whether Draven is positioned in the backline or front. Since Draven now does plenty of damage, especially with full items, it's not all that important to have a secondary carry. The goal with Draven is to burn through the enemy frontline as quickly as possible while keeping Draven alive. Learning to adapt your board to the lobby you're in is the best way for learning how to play Draven, so experiment with different combinations of synergies and champions to see what works best. Let's now move on to talking about a general how to play for each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. As mentioned earlier, the component with the highest priority from the opening carousel is the sword. Bow or glove are acceptable replacements, or you can aim for a defensive opening with a chain vest or belt. Just keep in mind that if you're not hitting at least one sword by the end of stage 2, you may want to consider playing a different carry. There's not a lot to focus on for the early stages of the game beyond playing it out normally. Look to level at standard times, play your strongest board, and have an item holder for Draven items. Since generic AD items work just fine, it means there's plenty of options for item holders. Callista, Riven, Nidalee, Vayne, and Varus are all viable as AD item holders. There's also Kled or Tristana, both of which open the possibility of pivoting into Hellion reroll. Whichever item holder you're able to secure, build a board around them with an emphasis on a good frontline. Keep in mind that doing well in the early game will buy you enough time later on to find a Draven 2, so make it your priority to minimize damage taken during stage 2. With that, we can move into the mid game where, once again, you want to be staying on the standard leveling curve, hitting level 6 on 3-2. At this point, you may need to roll if you had a rough stage 2. When rolling at level 6, the main goal is to find an upgraded item holder, be that 3 cost like Riven or 2 cost like Varus. Upgrading your frontline is ideal as well. Make sure you don't overroll at this stage, since the goal with Draven is to hit level 8 at a decent time. Be sure to pick up any potential 4 costs that are playable like Galio, Rel, or an early Draven. It's also not a bad idea to play champs like Jax or Aphelios, since they are also AD carries. Not only can they serve as item holders for Draven, they also open up the door for potential pivots. On 3-6, try to pick a Radiant item that helps your board win in stage 4, whether that's another carry item for Draven or utility like Radiant Locket. Moving into stage 4, it's important to remember to scout because multiple players may be contesting Draven. If they are, pivot. There's plenty of AD options in the meta to transition into, such as Aphelios, Riven, Akshan, Kayle, and even Jax, though he will fall off in the late game. Don't hard force Draven if it looks improbable to hit him after everyone has rolled a bit of gold at level 7. Speaking of level 7, this is where you ideally want to find at least one Draven. Begin piecing together your composition, but make sure you're not selling everything. Keeping upgraded champions is essential to not losing too much health in stage 4. Overall, the goal is to find Draven while maintaining a healthy economy to level to 8 in stage 5. Stage 5 is around the time the game transitions into the late game. Aim to level somewhere between 5-1 and 5-3, if not earlier. Roll to find Draven 2, though make sure you scout beforehand so you know what the potential odds are at hitting. Pick up other AD champions if you have the golden bench space, so that you have a transition ready if you're unable to find a Draven. And with that, the rest of level 8 is simple. Find Draven 2, continue filling out your comp, and upgrade the rest of your board. 5-cost champions aren't necessary to do well with Draven, but they are helpful, such as Gwen for Mystic, Viego for Forgotten Assassin, and Teemo as a general counter to other AD boards. Upgrading these champions is great, but not necessary, as the bulk of a Draven comp is going to be 3- and 4-cost champs. The rest of the late game is almost entirely about positioning. Level 9 is playable, but not obtainable in most games since it costs too much gold. If you do hit Draven 2 relatively early on in stage 4 or 5, then it's definitely a possibility to hit level 9, just don't throw away too much health to do so. Instead, it may be worth rolling for Draven 3, particularly if no one else is contesting. But as we said, positioning is essential for doing well with Draven in the late game. There's all kinds of potential ways that you can maximize the damage and survivability of Draven, but we'll touch on the two main factors that you need to consider. The first is Galio. Galio's taunt will draw the attention of enemy champions, keeping your Draven alive. That means you always want these two champions positioned somewhat near each other, whether Draven is in the front or not. Draven should almost never be in the back row anyway, so keep him in the second or third row and Galio on the same side as him in the front. Being diligent about these two champions' positioning relative to one another is another way to easily improve your late game with Draven. The second positioning tip is Draven does well in the front line, either on the very left or right side of the board. It may look silly, but it's a key position for Draven in surviving against champions like Vel'Koz or Lucian. As long as Draven is in the front row or the row behind it, he should avoid taking the brunt of the damage from those champions. Be sure to have Draven on the same side as them. This not only ensures that he won't be targeted by their ultimates, but also gives him access to killing those champions shortly after the fight begins. Just make sure, if you are frontlining Draven, that you're being diligent with scouting, as some matchups will be an insta-lose if he's in the front. All in all, if you learn the basics of positioning with Draven, the chances of top 4ing in the late game go up by a significant margin. That's all for today, folks. Looks like Draven is here to stay in the meta, at least for now. Hopefully, Draven remains a viable AD carry for the rest of the mid-set, especially since he's nearly unplayable up until recently. Let us know in the comments section below what composition you'd like us to cover in our next How to Play video. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.